Imagine a man who, at the age of 24, achieved something that many would consider the greatest sign of intellectual success: a position as a professor at a highly respected university. However, instead of following the traditional path that everyone expected, he left everything behind. He chose to distance himself from society and dedicated his life to deeply questioning every basis that supported the morals, religion, and society of his time. This man saw deeper truths than anyone before him, and in doing so, he ended up being consumed by the same truths he revealed. Grab your best glass of whiskey, because today we're going to delve into the life and thoughts of Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher who said God is dead. And now, think. If you discovered the harshest truths about existence, would you still have the courage to continue living? Everything that doesn't destroy me makes me stronger. Before we continue, take a deep breath and enjoy this phrase, one of the most famous of our guests today. She appears in the book Twilight of the Idols, one of those works that you finish reading feeling as if you had been shocked by reality itself. Nietzsche, you see, was not just a philosopher. He was a messenger of discomfort, an explorer of the darkest corners of the human soul. He would grab us by our clothes and say, "Wake up, because life doesn't come with an instruction manual." Born on October 15, 1844, in the small town of Rücken, Germany, Nietzsche began his career as an extremely talented young man. He was like a Mozart of philosophy, who exchanged the soft piano music for ideas so powerful that almost no one was ready to hear them. At 24, he was already a university professor, which, let's be honest, is the big dream of many scholars. And then you might think, okay, he's going to conquer the world. But that wasn't what happened. Nietzsche looked at the prominent position that fate offered him and replied, "No, thank you. I prefer to live far from everything, surrounded only by silence and my own ideas." And that's exactly what he chose to do. The most impressive thing is that Nietzsche, unlike many other great thinkers, was not concerned with pleasing or being well accepted. What he really wanted was to shake the foundations of what was accepted with the force of 1,000 thunders. What was the problem? He was dealing with ideas so powerful that it was like playing with radioactive energy without any protection. Nietzsche began to question absolutely everything: morality, religion, science, society, and even the idea of truth itself. It was as if he had declared war on the very foundations of Western civilization, and most incredible, he was winning. But, as with every great commander of thoughts, his victories also left deep scars. Nietzsche was deeply involved with an idea called the will to power, which he believed to be the true force that moves humans. But by looking so directly at this concept, he began to see something that few have the courage to admit. Behind every morality, every kindness, and every idea of right and wrong that we are taught, there is a raw need for power, dominance, and survival. At this point, you might think, is he overreacting? But is it really? What about the famous phrase, "God is dead"? It was not made as an attack, as many interpret without thinking, but rather as a sad and heavy observation about reality. Nietzsche was not celebrating the death of God, but lamenting the emptiness that death left us. Without a God to guide us, what are we left with? Nietzsche understood that nihilism, that is, the feeling that nothing has value or purpose, would be the next consequence of a humanity that destroyed its own gods. He knew we were on the edge of a great abyss, and the scariest thing of all is that he looked into that abyss, and as he himself said, "When you look into the abyss looks back at you." Nietzsche not only saw the abyss, he also greeted it. And this is where the collapse begins. Nietzsche, who already had fragile health and a restless mind, began to be dominated by the weight of his own ideas. He was a lonely man, misunderstood and perhaps even feared. His work wasn't selling well, his health was deteriorating, and his relationships were difficult, to say the least. Have you ever felt alone in a group of people who can't understand you? Now, imagine this in a much more intense way, with the added bonus of being considered crazy. In 1889, Nietzsche suffered a mental breakdown in Italy, a remarkable and tragic moment. He saw a horse being whipped, and in an act of pure empathy or perhaps desperation, he ran to hug it and cried, "I understand you." It was there that Nietzsche stopped being just a philosopher and became a human tragedy. Now tell me, would you have the courage to face the harsh truths of humanity like Nietzsche did? Could it be that, deep down, we are all running away from exactly what he desperately tried to show us? Oh, but don't rush. That was just the first sip of the night. Subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and tell me in the comments, what is the price you would be willing to pay for the truth? But first, finish your whiskey, because the journey is just beginning. Nietzsche, the messenger of challenging thought, was not satisfied with easy answers. He didn't just want to uncover the lies that hid humanity's true nature. He wanted to rip them off with force, as if he were removing an infected scab that had been on his skin for a long time. At 24, he was already a professor at the University of Basel, one of the most important in Europe. But what seemed like the pinnacle of a promising career was, for him, a gilded prison. He soon realized that the academy, with its strict rules and endless discussions, was not the right place for his creative mind, which functioned more like a force of nature than as part of a traditional system. Nietzsche needed space, silence, and freedom, not classrooms full of people repeating ideas without question. This is how he began to move away from academic life, exchanging the glories of an admired position for a solitary and wandering life. And I'm not using the word wandering figuratively. Nietzsche actually traveled from city to city, looking for places that would not worsen his fragile health. Yes, because the man who defied gods and humans was, ironically, a prisoner of his own body. He suffered from severe headaches, chronic digestive problems, and, it is believed, syphilis. Something that, at that time, was as common as oil barons showing off their mustaches. While facing his own physical difficulties, Nietzsche cultivated a mind that felt like a furnace, fueled by the flame of constant dissatisfaction. It was in this isolation that he began to create the ideas that would eventually transform the world. His first work, The Birth of Tragedy, celebrated the opposing forces of ancient Greek culture, the Apollonian and the Dionysian. For those who don't remember much about philosophy or have never had the opportunity, let me explain it in a simpler way. The Apollonians symbolized order, reason, and balance. Basically, everything that pleases conservative aunts and fans of well-organized spreadsheets. The Dionysian represented the opposite. It was chaos, passion, excess, the primal energy that drives music festivals and even those tequila-filled Friday nights. Nietzsche saw the tension between these two aspects as the true engine of human creativity. And guess what else he believed? That modern culture had completely lost this connection, sinking into a lifeless, Apollonian mediocrity. A devastating diagnosis for any society that prides itself on its civilization. Of course, the reaction to this work was disastrous. His mixture of erudition and an almost literary style confused many readers, and critics spared no effort in ridiculing him. But Nietzsche, being who he was, did not allow himself to be discouraged. He moved on, writing like someone marking his territory, producing works that challenged not only the common reader, but even the most prepared intellectuals. And that's where it comes in Human to Human, the beginning of an even more radical change. Nietzsche stopped trying to explain the world with philosophical abstractions and dove headfirst into reality as it really was. It was as if he was saying, enough beating around the bush, let's face the facts. And what were these facts? That morality, so exalted by religious and political institutions, was nothing more than a set of rules created by weak people to control the stronger. Nietzsche was obsessed with the idea that life did not have a fixed purpose or meaning, determined in advance. He believed that the entire human drama, with its churches, laws, schools, and systems, was just a desperate attempt to escape the most frightening truth. The truth that we are alone in the universe, with no one to save us or judge us. For Nietzsche, this was not something to lament, but something to celebrate. For if nothing has meaning, then we are free to create our own meaning. What Nietzsche called Superman was not a comic book hero with a cape, but the person who overcomes the emptiness of life and becomes the creator of his own story. However, exploring these truths came at a high price. Nietzsche paid with loneliness, a lack of understanding from others, and in the end, even with his own sanity. But even so, he still had a lot to say. And each new book I wrote was like a cry against the void. It was an attempt to break the silence of the universe with ideas that would echo for many years. In his journey almost like a prophet, trying to destroy the illusions that held society together, Nietzsche not only criticized the foundations of the world, but attacked these ideas with enormous force, as if he were a metaphorical sledgehammer. This energy, which seemed to come from the depths of his own despair, found its most brilliant and defiant form in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. This work, which Nietzsche considered his greatest philosophical achievement, is at the same time a poem, a prediction, and a confession. But any attempt to explain or classify what he did always ends up being a way of betraying what he really wanted to convey. Zarathustra, the main character and a version of Nietzsche, comes down from the mountain after spending years alone. He does not come to deliver new laws, but to destroy all the laws he found along the way. It's hard to miss the ironic comparison to Moses, a reference Nietzsche uses to show how his prophet is different from the heroes of the story. Zarathustra does not come to announce divine rules, but to talk about the death of God, not as something bad or tragic, but as a way to free ourselves. For him, the idea of God, or more specifically, the belief in a superior being who imposes rules and decides who will be rewarded or punished, is the greatest prison that human beings have ever created for themselves. And as Nietzsche makes us think, there is nothing more ironic than a prisoner who worships his own chains. But what exactly does the death of God mean? Nietzsche is not just saying that God ceased to exist, because in fact he believed that God never existed. What he really means is that belief in something divine has lost its importance, its power, and its meaning. In the words of Zarathustra, the world can no longer be explained or justified by religious stories. We are all living in a universe that doesn't care about us, without purpose or promises of a better future. And we have to face this emptiness without depending on hopes of heaven or divine reward. And here, Nietzsche has no mercy. God is dead. It's not just an observation. It's a difficult question. How can we live knowing that life has no great purpose? How do you deal with the responsibility of being the only person capable of writing your own story? Zarathustra's answer, and also Nietzsche's, is as daring as it is difficult to accept: the Superman. This figure is not, as many people have misunderstood, a defense of a superior type of person, whether by race, culture, or any other form of separation. On the contrary, the Superman is the one who goes beyond nihilism, who accepts that life has no greater purpose, and instead of despairing, creates his own meaning. He does not follow the values he inherited. He overcomes them, reinvents them, transforms them in his own way. He is a strong person, but not cruel. Powerful, but not tyrannical. As Nietzsche said, man is something that needs to be overcome. In other words, we are all on the move, on a journey. We are like a fragile bridge between what we were and what we can become. And, as expected, this idea was not well received. The book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, was ignored when it was released. Many people found it difficult to understand, and others found it arrogant. After all, who would have the courage to write a book that mixes philosophy, poetry, and religious stories, and still claim that it changed the course of history? Nietzsche, of course. And the world, trapped by its own ideas and rules, was not ready to accept something so bold. Meanwhile, Nietzsche's health continued to deteriorate, and he felt increasingly alone. the prophet of a new world was moving increasingly towards total isolation. The prophet of a new world was moving further and further away from people, living in isolation, while his mind, full of ideas, consumed everything around him, even himself. Zarathustra was not just a philosophy. It was also a reflection of Nietzsche's soul, showing his never-ending struggle against emptiness and his attempt to find a new way of living in a world that no longer made sense to him. The tragic irony of Nietzsche's life is that, while his ideas were beginning to be recognized and appreciated, he was losing his sanity. The philosopher who spent his final years fighting madness was the same one who dedicated his life to revealing hidden truths about the world. But at that time, the world couldn't understand his message, as if his words were written in a language no one else spoke. Perhaps this was because, deep down, people were afraid to face what Nietzsche was pointing out with so much certainty. After all, it's not every day that someone says that morals, religion, and even our civilization are like sandcastles, built to protect us from a deep fear of life. When Nietzsche completely lost his mind, he became, in a strange way, a perfect example of the ideas he defended. His life seemed like a play, full of cruel symbolism. The man who announced the death of God and the emergence of Superman ended up succumbing to human frailty in a brutal way. Nietzsche's mental breakdown, which occurred in 1889 in the city of Turin, began a decade of forced silence for him. Nietzsche, who once used words to cut through people's lies, became trapped in a state where he could no longer think or express himself. And what caused Nietzsche's downfall? There are several ideas, from diseases like syphilis, which seems like a simple and rather dull explanation, to the idea that he was consumed by the grandeur of his own ideas. Thinking that a mind so intense, so focused on seeking hard truths, could simply fall apart because of its own thoughts, doesn't seem so impossible. There is a limit to how much a person can take, even someone as special as Nietzsche. He wasn't a superhero. At the end of the day, he was just a human being, brilliant, but as vulnerable as the rest of us. As Nietzsche moved away from reality, his ideas began to reach the few readers willing to accept the challenge of his words. And here comes an irony in his story. The man who spent most of his life isolated, without being recognized, ended up becoming, after his death, a very important figure in the thoughts of many people. Not because everyone understood his ideas completely, because that's not what happened. Many times his ideas were misinterpreted, simplified, and even used in ways he never wanted. It is difficult to imagine anything more contrary to Nietzsche's spirit than seeing him transformed into a symbol of ideologies that he would never support, as happened later. A sad example of this was how Nazism tried to take their ideas for themselves. Nietzsche's sister, Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche, played a very important role in this era. She, as responsible for her brother's writings, not only changed and reorganized what he wrote to align with her own political beliefs, but also distorted what Nietzsche thought by trying to associate him with nationalism and hatred of Jews, ideas that Nietzsche never had. He, who criticized German chauvinism or exaggerated pride, and had strong words against the anti-Semitism of his time, was portrayed in the wrong way, as if he were a kind of precursor of the ideas that would later become part of the Nazi regime. The distortion of Nietzsche's ideas is so absurd that it's almost funny, if it weren't so sad too. Nietzsche, of course, could never imagine that his ideas would end up in the hands of people who only wanted to use them for their own interests. He would certainly have been disgusted by the way people came to worship him, almost like an icon. After all, he was always against the idea of authority or strict rules, but it was suddenly transformed into something almost religious. What Nietzsche left us were not rules to be followed, but an invitation to think, doubt, and reconstruct what we know. He wanted the world to question everything, even what he said. And yet what happened was the opposite. People began erecting statues and turning his words into banners for causes he would have found repulsive. Nietzsche's end is a clear example of how a person can be both very brilliant and very fragile at the same time. He showed us what it means to look into a great void, face fear, and describe it, even though you know that in doing so, you could be swallowed by that void. His life and ideas continue to be a reminder that thinking outside the box has a price. This price, for Nietzsche, was as great as the depth of his ideas. After his death, he not only faded into oblivion, but became almost a legend, an almost mythical figure, someone who seemed like a prophet for the modern world. However, this fame came with a big price. What Nietzsche wanted to tell us has been distorted in many ways, and his ideas about questioning and deep reflection have often been turned into simple phrases used on motivational posters or to justify political causes. Nietzsche became something like a Rorschach mirror, where people saw in him what they wanted to see. Some saw him as someone who paved the way for existentialists. Others saw him as an icon for nihilists. And rulers who wanted power misused his ideas, turning him into a symbol of supremacy, which would be the biggest insult to his legacy. And all this despite the several times he warned against simple or wrong interpretations of his words. As he himself wrote, "I am not a man, I am dynamite." Dynamite can be used to open new paths, but it can also cause great destruction. And, as we know, this is exactly what happened with Nietzsche's ideas. Soon after his death, his words were misused, turning Nietzsche into something he never was. He was always against the masses, religion, and ancient values, but after his death, he was placed on a pedestal, almost like a saint, as if the world needed to redeem itself for the way it treated him while he was alive. His sister Elizabeth had a great influence on this process. She manipulated his writings to create an image of Nietzsche that never existed, something that would have gone completely against everything he believed in, as he was dedicated to fighting lies and blind worship. Elizabeth's story is a perfect example of how Nietzsche's legacy has been tragically distorted. While he was alive, preaching against fixed truths and advocating continual change, his sister was doing the exact opposite behind the scenes. She tried to transform his philosophy, which talked about freedom of thought and constant change, into something rigid and fixed, molded to fit her own political and cultural ideas. It is difficult to say what Nietzsche would have found more revolting, whether it would have been the use of his ideas by nationalist groups or the fact that this was all done by his own family. He would probably have been outraged by both. But what happened after his death had another curious consequence. His philosophy, which was previously read only by a small group of intellectuals, became very popular and became a true cultural fad. Concepts such as the eternal return, the Superman, and the death of God were spread everywhere, as if they were simple ideas from a philosophy sale. However, while everyone was eager to consume these ideas, many ignored the depth they actually had. Phrases like, "What doesn't kill me makes me stronger," became popular, used to sell everything from self-help books to company training. Who would have thought that an idea from Nietzsche would be used to make the work environment more philosophical, right? But the most interesting thing about all this is that, even with so many changes and simplifications, the essence of Nietzsche's thought still manages to touch people. His ideas, like seeds thrown into the wind, end up growing in places he never imagined. They make people think, question, and sometimes even see new things. Even when they are misunderstood, something about their strength continues to attract people's attention. Nietzsche did not want to be a popular philosopher. He knew his ideas were like fire. They would burn anyone who got too close. And yet here we are, still trying to understand what he meant, still discussing his words, and still fascinated by this man who, in his loneliness and suffering, saw more clearly than many of us. And you, are you living a life that you would like to repeat forever? Or are you still bowing down to the idols that Nietzsche criticized so much? If these ideas made you think, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, so you don't miss the next videos, where we will philosophize in a fun and reflective way. And tell me in the comments, what scares you more, the emptiness of nihilism or the responsibility of living fully?